Thank you, John, very much for those good and undeserved remarks of introduction, and thanks to all of you who have so faithfully assembled here. I'm always, as a former mayor, thrown off by a standing ovation because during my time as mayor, when the crowd got up, they were usually after you. So I've always kept perspective on it, and before I thank Sister, I do want to acknowledge my daughter Maura and her husband, Ryan Fitzpatrick, and my son Rory and his wife, Stacy, and my grandson who's cheering for his grandfather, smart kid Grant. I want to thank Sister for the good work, and incidentally, those two that I've just introduced, they are products of the Sisters of St. Joseph for 12 years, and the role that the nuns have played in our lives across the Northeast in many instances has led to a culture that honored great undertakings of reading and writing. And when I hear the word solace, it does, in fact, the Irish word for light. I'm also reminded during the most grim moments of the Dark Ages, it was those Irish monks that retrieved the great documents of their time. The individuals who protected the scrolls and copied the history of those times because of their affection and regard for learning. And for a people who were so frequently under the heel of history and subjugated by a foreign power just a few miles away, they never lost that basic knowledge of what the role of learning could be in all of our lives. And the second thing that I want to note for our sisters and brothers from Haiti who are here tonight as well, always recall in Irish history Agatamor, the Great Hunger. It transformed our people. When the Irish talk about perhaps reaching a population again of maybe 8 million, that means that they will go back to the population that they had just before the Great Hunger. And when I hear people debate the role of food in our lives and the bounty that God has given us in America as to how we might share that with the rest of the world, that's not even a debatable moment. So that regard and affection for learning and the idea that what we have can be shared with all are important elements of what it is that Sister in the Irish Immigration Center continues to undertake. You've allowed me, during my time in the Congress and well before that, actually since the death of Bobby Sands, to participate in all of these it-will-never-happen moments. Just 3 weeks ago, I had breakfast with Jerry Adams in New York, and we reminisced about some of those very harsh days and how difficult it was. And Liam Maskey is here tonight. I was so happy to see him when I walked in. His brother Alex is a great friend of mine. I've stayed at his home, a home with barbed wire and cameras and iron gates around it. I always have a great moment of humor. Alec and I were at the British Embassy. Now, I could never tell anybody in Springfield I was at the British Embassy. But we were there, and I had had a chance to speak with Tony Blair and giving him credit for what he had done to advance the argument in the north of Ireland, a very small geographic area about the size of the state of Connecticut with 1.6 million people. And as we were leaving, the British paratroopers said to Alex, "Would you come with us? The helicopter's leaving." And he said to me, "Richie, the last time that British soldiers asked me to get on a helicopter, I went to jail for 5 years." And I'm reminded of how far we've come to advance that argument, which has now become a model for the rest of the world, where they now argue about water rates, education, and taxes, as opposed to necessarily what was once the argument of the day, how you worshiped. There is no longer a border to speak of. You move back and forth freely. The policing has been reformed. There is no longer the Royal Ulster Constabulary. It is now the Police Force of Northern Ireland, fully on the way to integration. Men and women sit in an assembly, reminding all of the role that politics plays and how we advance differences of opinions within the framework and the crucible of politics that takes us forward. There are no longer those vicious killings on a sectarian basis, but there's a ways to go, because when we reach our potential expands. It was the American dimension that was indispensable in bringing about that new day. To allow me 2 years ago to welcome Ian Paisley to the Capitol of the United States, that would have been unheard of a decade ago. First, he would not have accepted the invitation, and secondly, he would not have allowed me to introduce him at the proceedings. But to watch him sit next to Martin McGuinness at that event is a reminder of how far that process has come. That leads me to the second topic, the role of immigration in our lives. I keep on my desk in Washington small statue, small figurine of Annie Moore. And who was Annie Moore? She's the first immigrant to pass through Ellis Island. And she was about 5'4". And as she passed through Ellis Island on that fateful day, who would believe that she would have transformed all of America as she simply signed that document? You know, when Thoreau met Emerson, he commented on the fact that you never see a gray-haired Irishman, implying that they all died young because of the labors that they had undertaken. And when de Tocqueville offered his great epic, America, he commented on the fact that he thought that he had witnessed the despair of mankind when he saw the Negro in his chains. And then he said, but right after that, I saw the Indian in the forest, and I thought that that was worse than what I had seen with the Negro in his chains. And then he said, I saw how the Irish lived in American cities. The crowded tenement buildings with no hope of any opportunity, no welcoming at the dock, but people who in short time forged this grand opportunity, my grandparents included. And for the first generation, it was labor. And for the next generation, it was the civil service, cops and firemen and then teachers. And today, it's John Donahue. Today, a guy named Kelly runs Liberty Mutual. And previously, a guy named O'Connell ran Mass Mutual. I call that to your attention because it's part of the aspiration that my grandparents desired when they came here. They didn't come here for welfare. They came here to work. And that is something we need to keep perspective on in this debate. This week when I was nominated in the Democratic caucus, I was nominated by a Puerto Rican fellow from Chicago named Luis Gutierrez, who offered my name. And he has this very funny line that I think is very important because he's always on the talk shows. You've seen him. He's about 5'4", and he goes on, he takes on all the critics of immigration. And many of them have this notion, this conservative contention that they offer about the evils of immigration. And they stick to this line, oftentimes about religion. And Gutierrez always says to them, you love Jesus. How come you don't love Jesus? And it's a very important part of this consideration and this debate that we're having. And this week, Congress passed the American Dream Act. Frequently, when I would do talk radio, the conservative commentators would say to me, well, Congressman Neal, is there anything that George Bush has ever done that you could say you agreed with? And I would say, yes, immigration. And that would set them into the stratosphere. Because we need to note tonight that George Bush was right about immigration and building a path forward and asking those individuals to enter into a system that will bring them to citizenship. That's the American way. When Luis Gutierrez gets up and says, look, he said, it's a very simple proposal that we have with comprehensive education and immigration. Learn English, he says that. Learn English, pay for documentation, and get in line. Who can't agree with all of that? That's essentially the proposal that we have. I used to kid Ted Kennedy all the time when we would go to the other one's office. And I would say to him, you know, the Fitzgeralds got to Congress in 2 generations. It took the Kennedys 4. It only took the Neals and Garveys 1 to get a member of Congress. And I bring that up to you because remember, as we leave the hotel tonight, You know those people that say hello and cheer for us frequently? One of the things that we need to remember, they're the ones that make the hotel beds. And in Springfield, they're the ones that sweep the suites around the hotels. They're the individuals who frequently in Boston, Worcester, and Springfield who are Irish, who live here as the undocumented. And the problem with that argument is they can never return for a funeral. They can never return for a baptism. They can never return for a wedding. We need to change that system and incorporate broad-scaled immigration reform and give them the same chance that my grandparents desired. And as I looked across this room tonight, that your grandparents, because I know many of you, we were all brought here in different ways. But the truth is, it was still the aspiration of America that set us apart. So, sister, I want to thank you. I have received many acknowledgments for my work in Ireland over the years, and this is one of the nicest because you've broadened that whole context of what it means at the Irish Immigration Center. And it essentially means unity without uniformity. Thank you all very much.